To start with, I mean, I just want to try to introduce some of you who might not come from the marine science background. What are zooplankton? And this is just a bunch of these sorts of little animals. There's a huge number, a huge diversity of them. They range from bacteria to protists to copepods, crustacea, and not only that, they pass through many different life stages within the planktonic stage. This is, for instance, the young of that particular guy. And just without going into too much detail, the most important things, germane things for this presentation is that zooplankton are typically small. They are on the order of microns to centimeters, basically. They're pelagic. They inhabit a 3D watery world, in other words, wet. And while they are planktonic, they drift. They are capable of limited swimming. And most important part about the zooplankton part is that they're heterotrophic. They gain their energy by eating other things. And that eating other things is actually quite an important aspect of what comes about. Just to follow on that, this is a very highly simplified cartoon of a marine ecosystem. And just to put this in context of how the realm or the environment that zooplankton live in, I thought I'd just go through this very quickly. Essentially, phytoplankton, the little plants in the sea, they capture sunlight, and together with carbon dioxide and nutrients, they produce organic matter. And those guys are then eaten by the zooplankton, the ones that are topical, the main topic of this. And those zooplankton pass through, get eaten in turn by fish, and the fish are caught by fishermen and so end up on our tables. That is a very highly simplified view. After, let's say, 30-odd years ago, people started to realize that the way that the whole system acted together was a lot more complex than they originally thought. It's not a linear process, but there's a whole range of different processes going on, especially as material is produced here on the upper layers and sinks down through particulate matter that's being produced by this process. It's a very inefficient process, and dissolved organic material and particle detritus rains down or ends up in the water column, which then feeds an entire microbial loop. And that's very important for the regeneration, the recycling of nutrients, which eventually come back here and run through this whole system again. So this is the microbial loop part of it, just adding one layer of extra complexity on the entire marine ecosystem. And this is another important aspect of the entire process, that as this process goes through from phytoplankton through zooplankton and towards fish, a certain amount of this material, detrital material, sinks into the deep ocean, where it's remineralized by bacteria and nutrients are dissolved there. These zooplankton and the fish also undergo migration. And this process is known as the biological pump, and it's very important for the sorts of problems that we're facing now, carbon, the sequestration of carbon. Every time this draws in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through to the surface ocean and down into the deep ocean where it's sequestered. And zooplankton play an important role of that. So a very brief summary of what zooplankton are. They have a pivotal trophic role. They're essentially primary grazers of phytoplankton and a fish food. That's a pivotal position. They play a role in the carbon cycle, in the carbon cycling of the oceans, and are capable of complex behavior. Amongst other things, foraging, migration, courtship, mixotrophy, all these different things that they're capable of. And each one of this is my contention, that those sorts of complex behaviors are open to rational interpretation. I'm not meaning to say that zooplankton are rational thinkers. It's just that their behavior is open to rational behavior, hence rational in the title of my thesis. And I hope to be able to explain to you precisely how that works. Now, however you look at a marine ecosystem or any ecosystem at all in general, they are complex. They are simply a complex interplay of many, many different species composed of millions or billions of individuals, each interacting with each other in some sort of self-organized way through many different sorts of trophic roles. And this is a complex system. And essentially my contention is that complex systems emerge from simple rules. This is an important crux, okay? That complex system, the complexity of something like a marine ecosystem can be looked at, can be understood in terms of relatively simple rules. Now, I don't take that sort of straight out of my head. It sort of falls under, you can justify this with Occam's razor, all right? That plurality is not to be posited without necessity. In other words, it's the law of parsimony. If you can say something simpler with less assumptions, fewer assumptions, then you're on the right track. It's not actually a law in the same way that the second law of thermodynamics is a law. It's just a really good idea, okay? So unraveling complexity. Now, where do you look? Where do you actually look for the simple rules that drive this entire process? And I suggest that it's at the level of the individuals. That's exactly where you see the simple rules. And why the individual? Because that is the level where organisms first impact or first feel direct impact from the physical environment. That's where turbulence acts, that's where temperature acts, that's where all kinds of physical processes actually impact the marine life or life in general. So it's the physics, it's the physical environment. That's one reason. The other reason is that is exactly the place where interactions take place. Nothing happens in the marine environment unless one tiny little guy meets another little guy and something happens. One gets eaten or something happens. So it's the interaction term right there at that level of the individuals that is critically important. And the third element of why individuals is important is that it's at the level of individuals that natural selection takes place. In other words, the evolutionary processes that drive the shaping of species is enacted at the level of individuals. So that's individual-based zooplankton ecology. Now, how to try to formulate that in a more concrete sense? All organisms, zooplankton included, are confronted by three overarching tasks. They've got to find food, they have to reproduce, and they have to avoid being eaten. Simple enough, all right? Now, all of those important life processes for a planktonic organism are regulated by encounter rates. Each one of those, how often or how fast or how many times does it actually encounter one or other of those things? An encounter with a prey, that says something about growth. How much food they get in, that says something about growth. All right? The encounter with a mate, it sort of regulates the rate at which they can reproduce. All right? And death is the likely outcome of an encounter with a predator. So it's precisely those sorts of things. And much of my thesis, much of the book that many of you have there in front of you, deals with precisely the mechanistic dependencies that regulate encounter rate. It's got to do with, there's four basic things that go into regulating encounter rate. The abundance of partners, how many things there are there to encounter. The speed, the relative speed of motion, how things move relative to each other, geometry of trajectory, and perception distance. And just to go through them so that, you know, much of my thesis is actually in these next couple of slides. You'll see a little chapter number there, right? Encounter rates, chapter 2, right? You'll find that in there. And then this is the aspect that abundance of partners, that's an important aspect. And it's got to do with population dynamics and patchiness. I have a whole chapter on patchiness if you're interested in that. So, you know, abundance of partners. Relative speed of motion. There are two basic aspects of that that are really important. One is the hydrodynamics of locomotion. How does one of these little critters, how do these animals actually move through fluids and interact and bump into each other? And the other one, and the other aspect of that that's really important is turbulence. They live in a fluid environment, and the fluid environment is subject to turbulence at one level. It's the cascading of energy from various sources down into microscales, and that has an impact on how organisms move relative to each other. Geometry of trajectory. I spend a lot of time on this, and it might seem a bit nerdy, but it's actually a fascinating field. And you know, this, what is the geometry of how an organism passes through its three-dimensional world to search for resources? And there's ballistic, which is straight line, and then there's diffusive, a random walk, the drunkard's walk, if you will. You know, everybody understands the basic search pattern of a drunk trying to find his house, you know, or whatever. And then there's this whole area which is in between levee walks, and if you wonder why there's an albatross underneath that, you know, there's a fascinating story which will take you know, another half hour should I, you know, if you should ever be interested in that. And then there's perception distance. Perception distance is critically important for encounter rates, and many marine zooplankton species use hydrodynamic signals in detecting their surroundings. They're blind, they live in this fluid environment, they have these antennae, and Mimi, you can do this much better than me, but you know, they have these antennas from which they can derive information about the movement of water, of organisms within the water, and there's a whole fascinating mathematical side of that that you can actually go into. So hydrodynamics, but there's also light and chemicals, of course. Chemicals is another important cue for how organisms interact with each other, either finding prey or finding mates, in particular finding mates. So there you have it. For any given behavior, this is the important thing, for any given behavior, there are trade-offs to be made between beneficial encounters and detrimental encounters. Any organisms that moving through any environment cannot actually be a superorganism. It always has to make some sort of trade-off between encountering things that are good and encountering things that are bad. So, rational behavior. This is where we start, you know, of why do organisms do what they do? There's a copod. Well, they do, of course, they do what they do because they want to promote their own fitness. And this, of course, is Darwin's central idea that, you know, organisms, or that life is shaped by natural selection, and that natural selection impacts their fitness. So that's, yeah, okay, Darwin's central concept. That fitness, a measure of how well an individual organism can survive and reproduce. And of course, it's the driving force of evolution. But it's not just in the geologic past. The echoes of evolution can be seen in how organisms behave today. They have this inbuilt, mechanism, or it's inbuilt algorithms, behavioral algorithms that have been shaped by natural selection. So that is one of the cruxes here. So if we can mechanistically determine how evolutionary, in other words, reproductive success in a very simple way, is governed by behavioral strategies in a given physical setting, and assuming that behavioral algorithms, these little bits of computer code, you can think of them like that, are much more complicated than that, but I mean, just think of them like little bits of script, that these are inheritable traits, then we have a means of predicting what behavior organisms should adopt in nature for a given physical setting. In other words, the behavior of these organisms is an emergent property of individual organisms. It's simply an emergent property. Estimating fitness. It's one of the most difficult things to actually do, and is one of the hindrances why biological sciences have been handicapped in, shall we say, becoming a more concrete science like physics or chemistry. It's simply that the central concepts of biology, this idea of fitness, is simply an extremely difficult, slippery thing to actually determine mathematically. And that which comes closest, in other words, closest and the simplest, is this idea of Rolf Visser, and is a reproductive value. In other words, an organism has lived up to now, it has a chance of surviving up to that time, and how many offspring it's had within that time, and that's its reproductive value at that particular time. But you can project this into the future, all right? And there it is. If an organism has no expectation, has no way of figuring out if its conditions are going to improve or not, you know, then it's best. Then the expected reproductive value that it will have is determined by this. And that's simply the ratio of its instantaneous mortality rate to the ratio of its instantaneous reproductive rate to its instantaneous mortality rate. And this is the principle of this is as good as it gets. In other words, it's simply not going to get any better than that. And those processes that go into that are dependent on a whole raft of physical and biological parameters, each of which impacts directly on that reproductive value. And it's an extremely amenable sort of thing. You can go through this and try to look at it in a little bit more of a mechanistic sense. There's expected fitness for a particular behavior. You can break that down into essentially energy income. So if you say that there's a particular energy cost of producing a single surviving offspring, then it's the rate at which energy comes in times that particular factor. And you can break down that even to more. So there's the net income of energy due to a particular behavior minus the cost of actually executing that behavior divided by this mortality. And there's an important part there. There's the mortality that simply can't avoid, and there's the marginal mortality or the marginal risk that's due to particular behavior. And the simple way of looking at that is that this is the trade-off. Fitness is in some sense benefit minus cost divided by risk. You can think of that in a very simple sense along those lines. And there it is. There's your little bunny rabbit, reproducing, finding food, and avoiding predation. All right? And an organism should choose this behavior so as to maximize this particular fitness. And natural selection has provided organisms with behavioral algorithms to do precisely that. So now we come back to our little plankton story. All right? Here they are, mechanistic dependencies. There's your swimming plankton, and these are the dependencies that they rely on. Path geometry is one particularly important aspect of this, and we can talk about that in terms of random motion. There it is there. It has an important shaping principle for all of modern science or modern physics, also in mathematics, financial markets, but also in foraging theory. And to see how that works, simply put, an organism, the most efficient way for an organism to search for food is to simply go in a straight line. That's simply the most efficient way for it to find food. You can argue, you can go through this argument in various different ways, but it's simply to move like that, because any time it stops and turns, it'll sweep out or it'll overlap with some part of that. But at the same time, moving in a straight line is the most dangerous thing to do. It's the most risky, for the simple reason that the distance that this guy can predict its food is much smaller than the distance that a predator can in general detect him. You can look at it like this. So there's a benefit, which is the path that is swept out like that with a small radius. And there's a risk, which is the much larger volume that that same path engenders. How can an organism modify that? Well, it can modify that by simply introducing a degree of curvature to its trajectory. And I've done this here in this sort of wiggly path here. And it just goes to show, or just illustrates that once it starts to go through a curvy trajectory, it has a large degree of overlap. So it's reducing the volume that it's exposing itself to in risk. The way of, a very, let's say, mathematical way of treating this has got to do with the rate of the increase of the Wiener sausage. The Wiener sausage is a mathematical entity. It's the volume swept out by a translating sphere which is following a random walk. And it's not got to do with these sorts of things, even though it might look like that. It's got to do with Norbert Wiener, a mathematician who invented these things, all right? So that's like it. But essentially, you can analyze it in this way. You have an organism that's swimming in some particular way, and its path is characterized by speed and a bendiness, this lambda here, that says something about how convoluted the path is. At the same time, it has a radius to detect prey, and so it sweeps out a particular area due to that, and also has a particular sort of danger zone that it also sweeps out a volume according to that. And you can go through and write precisely that formula, which is the trade-off again, benefit minus cost divided by risk, and there's a plot of those. So predation increases, so where that peaks for a particular predation level, that is the optimum ratio, or the optimal ratio of its detection distance to the curviness of its path. And does that actually work? Sure it does. You know, we've measured this in the lab. This is a whole bunch of organisms ranging from bacteria over here all the way down to adult copepods down there. And this is the size of the organism, and by looking at their swimming paths, we can determine their motility length scale. And that's what the measurements are, lambda equals that, you know, and that's what the predicted one is. So pretty damn close. The point is, you know, this is a log-log plot, and anybody can plot anything on there, and you get a straight line, right? But that's not the point here. The point here is that the slope is exactly 1. Now that is the important point, all right? So, you know, from that log-log plot, that's that slope value that is precisely there. In other words, you have a direct allometric scaling between the predator-prey relationships to the way organisms utilize three-dimensional space and foraging for food. Speed, that's also another important thing. Foraging effort, if you want to have a look at it like that. For any swimming process, the amount of energy that an organism gains depends on its swimming speed. If it swims too slow, it simply just doesn't see enough food, all right? And if it swims too fast, it's way too costly. So somewhere in between, there's an optimal swimming speed. And you can go through that for different concentrations of prey and predator or whatever, but the important thing here is that this is the swimming speed here, here. Concentration of prey increases that way, predation risk increases that way. This indicates that an organism should simply swim slower or put less effort into foraging as both predation, or either predation risk increases or the number of prey increases. In other words, if there's lots of prey, don't waste energy looking for it. You know, there's lots around, you know, just slow down, take it easy, you know. And if there's a lot of predators around, you know, it's like, oh, I better stay, you know, it's like keep under the radar, basically. So in both cases, the foraging effect, you know, causes this sort of change. Now, you can think about this, you know, okay, that was based on the individual level, but here it is, you know, it's like thinking about how this might connect together. This is exactly what I said before. More predators, swim slower, encounter less prey. In other words, the fact that there's more predators causes the grazer, in this case the copepod, to find and ingest less prey, right? So you're reducing the grazing pressure on something that's disconnected from the actual causal effect. In the same way, you can turn the whole thing around. Here it is, more prey, swim slower, encounter less predators. Put it this way, that there are intrinsically behaviorally mediated trophic cascades that emerge out of this process. In other words, changing abundance here, fish for instance, changes the interaction rates not just here, but also here. In the same way, changing the abundance down here changes the interaction strength not just here, but also here. It changes the entire dynamics or the entire topology of these sorts of simple webs. And while you know, I can't offer particularly strong evidence to support this, there are these sorts of you know, these tricks that organisms have actually learnt that are based on this principle, and this is indirect behaviorally mediated interactions. And it's got to do with the fact that you have these large predatory piscivorous fish, that's a difficult word to say, piscivorous fish that are swimming around and patrolling the flanks of large schools of krill. The krill, of course, they gain protection from this because those tuna, in this case, are actually keeping away the predators, but the tuna in their own right are gaining benefit from the presence of the krill because they use them as bait. You know, so there are these sorts of interactions that are based principally on that. Reconstructing complexity. So we've gone down, we deconstructed it, now we're going to reconstruct it. Ecosystem model, there it is. There's not much to it, but that actually belies, this is an equation that actually describes something very complex like that. The fact that it's very simple like that actually belies in you know, an awful lot of complexity. Because the x's are sort of basically a vector which says something about the abundance of all those species in there, so sharks, marlins, tuna, squid, etc., all the way down there, all right? And that M, that's actually a really important thing. That's called the community matrix, and it says something about the interaction strengths between them all. So somewhere in there, one of these little things, I've just colored them, you know, otherwise they're numbers, but somewhere in there, there's a little box that describes the red arrow that goes from tuna down to amphipods, for instance. So there's any number of ways of doing this. Now, this mathematically is a dynamic system, and it's open to all those wonderful things that dynamic systems are open to: stability, oscillations, and chaos. That's where chaos, came. Now, one man in particular opened this field or expressed, or actually stimulated this field way back 40-odd years ago by looking at that community matrix and saying, look, if I just make more and more and more and more actors in that particular ecosystem description, then mathematically the whole system becomes totally unstable. The more actors in a system like that, the more unstable. Now, that flies in the face of what people knew or understood up until then, basically. The more diverse an ecosystem was, the more stable it was. But here was a mathematical description that said the opposite. Now, Robert May, it was just Bob May at the time, but since then he's become Baron May of Oxford, 40 years later. He never actually believed it, but he challenged people to elucidate the devious strategies by which nature can actually make this happen. So, much like, if you have a theory and you make a measurement or you make an observation and it fits the theory, you've just made a measurement, right? But if you make a theory and you find something that's totally opposite, then you've made a discovery. So people have been trying to unravel this or try to figure out what these devious strategies are. And there's a whole bunch of them. Spatial dimensions, weak links, viruses and microbes, the fact that life history, these organisms, they actually have to go through a life stage where they go from one little box to another box. And then there's adaptive behavior, which is the one that I want to just mention here. And you can sort of see how this works, right? There's a very simplified version of that entire ecosystem, just the Locker-Volterra description of these two different, so a ciliate and a copepod in this case. And you can sort of see that over there are the interaction terms, and the interaction term between these two depends on the behavior of both parties, not just him, not just the copepod or the ciliate, but both parties have a role to play in the interaction term. Not only that, they have to try to trade off their particular fitness between a balance of those two terms. In other words, there's a whole complex mechanisms that are embedded within this that are dynamic. In other words, that community matrix is dynamic. And this, of course, opens up the entire, area of game theory, which apparently was invented by Russell Crowe, but I'm not going to talk about that. The tritrophic systems is a little bit more amenable, and basically it's based on the idea that you can decompose sort of complex systems into smaller community structures. And a triangular arrangement is actually not a bad way to go. If you want to build any sort of complex thing, you can always build it up by sticking triangles together, essentially. So a tritrophic system is actually quite a good thing to look at. And there's one that you could look at, is called integral predation, and omnivory broadly falls into that category. And there you can sort of see that there's a resource over here, say a diatom that's being fed on by a ciliate, that's the consumer, C over here, and they are both being fed on by a top predator, a copepod over there. Now, this is a very difficult position for this guy to be because this consumer, it is both prey and has to compete with its predator. That's a tricky position to actually sit yourself in, and theoretically those systems are extremely unstable and should not exist, but the world is full of examples. So there's another little paradox, a somewhat trimmed down paradox. And while I could show many mathematical equations about this, I thought I'd just adapt, just do it very quickly. If you have this non-adaptive, in other words, all those interaction terms are totally fixed, then you'll end up with something that says that there's an entire region of state space which is chaotic. In other words, subject to stochastic extinction, if you will. So you have these huge oscillations, and any time it hits somewhere down here, you can actually generate some extinction. In other words, that's the instability that people talk about in chaotic systems. But if you allow this guy, the consumer, that one that was sort of like in that really difficult position, to actually adapt its behavior to its own best purposes, then an entire part of instability disappears and the entire system becomes stable, simply by the fact that that consumer is now behaving in a way to best promote its own fitness. In other words, adaptive behavior promotes ecosystem stability by damping out oscillations. And it's the evolutionary self-interest of that little guy in the middle that actually promotes that. So through all of that, I think I've tried to outline exactly, my reasoning for how individuals, the behavior of individuals, shaped by their physical environment, by their interactions with others, but also by the evolutionary processes which have given them the algorithms to actually work within that, how they can conspire to produce complex systems, and the stability of the stability of diverse marine ecosystems. In other words, the devious strategies that May talked about weren't devious at all. They're actually just evolutionary processes. Concluding remarks. Well, how do we actually fit this into the broader picture? And one of the things that I'm always struck by is that the physical environment is shaped by life. Simply has been in the past. I mean, the atmosphere that we breathe, the climate that we live under, and even the rocks that we stand on, all have been shaped in some way by life processes on Earth. Now, of course, when the Earth is being projected into the Anthropocene, where human activities are becoming so much more profound, the driving question is how will the physical and the biotic system, how will it respond? And there are responses, how it will respond, but there's also feedbacks. And I want to highlight that with this, little cartoon here, which shows that triangular interplay between how the climate operates here, the biological oceanography in particular, or the biosphere over here, and the physics, the physical processes that generate these two. So there is that intricate interplay between each one of those. And as we're going into that Anthropocene, reliable models or reliable predictions can no longer be based simply on empirical evidence from the recent past. We simply need to have extra information. And it's my contention in this process to say that a lot of that extra information can be found in trying to unravel this complexity through looking at the mechanisms which drive individual interactions or individual behavior of organisms. And that will have then repercussions on how we can predict or how we can understand ecosystem functioning, species richness, and even carbon cycling. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.